3 years after my marriage collapsed, I stood on a stage in a black-tie ballroom, lights in my eyes, executives watching my every move. And then I saw her, my ex-wife, sitting in the audience, crying. In that moment, every failure, every night I thought my life was over, every dollar I lost and rebuilt flashed through me at once. She had left when I had nothing, and now she was watching me speak from the center of the world she once believed I'd never reach.
Life, as I knew it, felt steady, almost comfortably predictable, and yet there was always this faint, unspoken tension that reality could change at any moment. My name is Brandon, and 3 years ago, I thought I had everything figured out. A stable job as a back-end software engineer at Airbnb, a secure income, a life planned down to routines, and a marriage to Catherine, a woman I genuinely believed I knew completely. We met at the local gym where she worked at the front desk. There was something effortless about our conversations that drew me in, a magnetic energy that made our chats feel natural and easy, as if the universe had designed our paths to cross. Over months, those conversations deepened into dates, and dates into a commitment I believed would last forever. We married, thinking love and trust were shields strong enough to withstand anything. Our routines seemed ideal. I maintained financial stability, while Catherine, ambitious and capable, explored freelance opportunities I encouraged, wanting to see her flourish beyond the confines of a gym desk. At the time, I thought I was doing the right thing, supporting her ambitions, offering guidance, and creating a partnership where we could both grow. But the calm I cherished was fragile, and the cracks were subtle, almost invisible at first. They hid behind our shared laughter and weekend plans, whispering that life had its own design. I didn't see the looming storm yet, but looking back now, every small choice, every encouragement I gave, every reassurance that I could handle the world for both of us was quietly laying the groundwork for the tests to come. We had no children yet, no pressing external pressures other than the usual financial responsibilities. But even in that relative simplicity, life was already proving it had its own way of unraveling certainty. I remember thinking about our future, how Catherine's potential could elevate both of us, how my projects at work could expand into something more, and how together we could tackle the world. I never imagined that in just a few short years, those visions would collide violently with reality, that the foundation of what I believed to be secure would shift beneath my feet, leaving me questioning not only my marriage, but the very understanding of who I was as a partner, a professional, and a human being navigating forces beyond my control. At the time, I felt confident, in control, ready to face whatever challenges arose, yet the universe was quietly orchestrating circumstances that would test everything I knew about love, resilience, and survival. And so, this is where my story begins. Not with chaos, not with betrayal, but with a life that seemed perfect, stable, and predictable. Because it is only from a place of apparent calm that true disruption can hit with maximum force. And the lessons to follow would not come from comfort, but from endurance, adaptation, and the realization that everything you hold as permanent can vanish in ways you never anticipated. What you're about to read is the unraveling of that calm, the tipping point between stability and chaos, the moment when certainty is replaced with questions, and the life I thought I had becomes a memory I can only reconstruct in fragments, understanding finally that nothing in life is guaranteed and that the path to recovery begins long before the storm hits. After we married, life seemed steady on the surface, a routine that carried a deceptive ease. But I was beginning to notice subtle cracks beneath the everyday flow, hints of tension that I couldn't yet name. Catherine was diving into freelancing, learning the skills I had shown her, taking on projects, pitching to clients, and gradually building a small business. And I felt pride that masked a quiet unease. Our conversations, once effortless and full of laughter, started carrying tiny frictions, small pauses, and muted irritations that seemed insignificant at the time, but now feel like the first warning signs. I would ask her about a client, a deadline, or a project, and her responses sometimes felt sharp, clipped, or distracted, as if something else weighed on her mind, though I had no way of knowing what it was. Financially, I remained stable, keeping my work at Airbnb going, confident that we had a secure foundation, while Catherine's earnings fluctuated wildly, reflecting the uncertainty of a new path. I thought this was part of the natural adaptation to change, telling myself patience and understanding would see us through. Yet, in retrospect, these were subtle signals that the dynamics of our relationship were shifting. One minor disagreement about household chores or a missed dinner could flare into tension far stronger than it should, and I often found myself analyzing her tone, her posture, the slight narrowing of her eyes, cataloging patterns I didn't yet fully understand. Even routine plans, a trip, a shared errand, or a casual dinner, were accompanied by small undercurrents of irritation or impatience, moments that hinted at hidden fractures in the trust and connection we had once taken for granted. I began noticing that my own mood started adjusting in response. Small anxieties, subtle defensiveness, and quiet questioning of whether I was doing enough to maintain stability. The calm that seemed to surround us was deceptive, fragile, almost precarious, and I realized only later that this period, while seemingly ordinary, was quietly preparing me for the upheaval to come. I didn't yet know that one minor misunderstanding or overlooked comment could escalate into a much larger rupture, one that would test every part of who I was and how I responded under pressure. Looking back, these months were critical. An internal education in observing behavior, cataloging patterns, and understanding that even when life feels steady, the undercurrents are constantly shaping the future. The subtle frictions and the small irritations were not just annoyances, they were the first indicators of a storm gathering, a hint that comfort and stability are always conditional, always susceptible to disruption. At the time, I told myself it was just growing pains, adaptation to change, and the natural stress of financial and personal development. But in truth, I was witnessing the very early stages of fracture, a quiet reminder that nothing, not even love or shared history, is invulnerable. This module is about noticing, about awareness, and about the first small signs that calm can be misleading, that beneath smiles and surface routines, the tiniest sparks can ignite a chain of events that will redefine a life. And while there was no immediate catastrophe, a casual argument, a delayed response, or a slight look of frustration could have been the first tangible trigger of a larger upheaval, one that would ultimately shape the trajectory of my marriage, my resilience, and my understanding of how fragile trust and connection truly are. As Catherine's freelancing career picked up, I began noticing subtle shifts in her behavior that left me unsettled. I would catch myself hesitating before asking even the simple questions, unsure if my words might spark an overreaction I wasn't ready for. Even mundane conversations about bills, groceries, or weekend plans became exercises in careful observation, gauging her tone and timing before speaking. At first, I tried to attribute these changes to stress or the pressures of adapting to a new work routine. But small incidents began accumulating into an unmistakable pattern. She would cancel plans at the last minute with a shrug that stung, reply to texts with curt one-word answers, or snap at me over minor oversights that previously wouldn't have mattered. One evening, I asked her to help review some project details I was struggling with. Her response was sharp, dismissive, and laced with blame, as if my request was a burden rather than a need. That moment felt like the first clear crack in the life we'd built together. Financial strain after my Airbnb layoff amplified the tension. I suggested she pitch in to balance our dwindling resources, and what should have been a practical discussion turned into frustration on her part. Arguments grew, small grievances became major fights, and I began cataloging the subtle patterns of her reactions, which topics triggered irritation, what times of day her patience thinned, and how small requests could ignite disproportionate responses. It wasn't just about money or logistics anymore. It was about a growing emotional distance, the feeling that the person I married was morphing into someone I didn't recognize. At the same time, I noticed my own mindset shifting. I became guarded, careful with words, and constantly analyzing her responses for hidden meaning, aware that one misstep could escalate tension further. The calm we once relied on felt fragile, and beneath that fragile veneer, an underlying tension threatened to fracture everything we'd worked for. One afternoon, after a minor disagreement about household chores, Catherine left the room in silence, slamming the door behind her. I remember sitting there, stunned, realizing that the invisible thread holding our relationship together had begun to fray. That single incident crystallized what had been simmering. Observation alone wasn't enough. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were personal, emotional, and pressing. I understood then that the next miscalculation, however small, could push us past a point of no return. The tension, previously internal and reflective, now had the weight of consequence. Every gesture, every word, every glance mattered. I was caught in a precarious balance, trying to navigate a partner's changing demeanor while confronting my own growing anxiety. And beneath it all, a quiet awareness settled in. The life I thought was stable and predictable had already begun shifting, and I could sense that the first major rupture was imminent, a turning point that would force action, not just reflection. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, but the first real fracture hit when Catherine began making choices that directly undermined the life we had carefully constructed together. I remember that morning vividly. I had prepared an outline for a client project that was critical to keeping my side venture afloat, and when I asked for her input on a small logistical point, she scoffed, dismissing it as unimportant, as if my work and ambitions were trivial compared to her own growing sense of entitlement. It wasn't just the words she used, it was the way she tilted her head, eyes cold and disinterested, the kind of subtle body language that carries more venom than any outburst. That tiny interaction triggered a ripple effect. My focus shattered, my patience thinned, and suddenly every minor obstacle seemed amplified. Over the next few days, I noticed more overt patterns. She began leaving bills unpaid, citing minor oversights, and made pointed comments about my income and the precariousness of my freelance work, as if to remind me that my stability was fragile and conditional. I started cataloging these incidents, as I had silently cataloged her moods before, but now the stakes were concrete. My financial projects were being affected, deadlines were slipping, and the careful equilibrium I'd built for both of us was collapsing under pressure. One afternoon, she outright refused to attend a virtual client meeting with me, claiming she was too busy to help even though it was a 15-minute check-in. The fallout was immediate. I scrambled to cover the meeting alone, improvised on points I hadn't prepared, and ended up leaving a critical impression that could have cost me future contracts. That moment crystallized a horrifying realization. Her behavior was no longer merely irritating or emotionally draining. It was actively jeopardizing my work, my independence, and the fragile sense of progress I had clawed back during the pandemic. Anger and hurt battled inside me, but I forced myself to stay composed. Outwardly, I maintained calm. Inwardly, I recorded, observed, and plotted. The contrast between her blatant disregard for our partnership and my methodical approach to containing the damage was stark, and it made me acutely aware that this was no longer a simple marital disagreement. This was a test of control, resilience, and patience under escalating pressure. By the end of that week, the emotional strain had reached a tipping point. We argued over small, mundane matters that should have been inconsequential, but the arguments carried the weight of months of subtle erosion. I began noticing that she deliberately withheld information, contradicted me in front of mutual contacts, and subtly manipulated situations to make me appear incompetent or inattentive, all while presenting herself as reasonable and poised to outsiders. It was infuriating, disorienting, and frightening. I realized I had to be careful with every word, every action, every plan, because any lapse could be weaponized. That was the first fracture, the moment I understood that our relationship had transitioned from mutual partnership to asymmetric struggle, and that every attempt to reconcile or explain would now be met with resistance or indifference. It forced me to accept that patience alone wouldn't be enough to restore stability. Action was inevitable, even if incremental, precise, and measured. And beneath the rage and betrayal, a strange clarity emerged. I couldn't control her actions, but I could control my response, my focus, and my preparation. I had reached the point where observation alone had transitioned into strategy, where the stakes were no longer hypothetical, and where the first fracture demanded that I adapt, survive, and ultimately rise above the chaos she was creating in my carefully rebuilt world. After the first fracture, I realized that passive observation and quiet endurance weren't enough. The days of waiting for Catherine to revert to the person I once knew were over, and if I wanted to preserve my sanity, my independence, and my projects, I had to take concrete steps, calculated, deliberate moves that would reassert control over my life without losing composure or credibility. I began with small but meaningful actions, reorganizing my finances to create a buffer against her unpredictable spending, documenting every interaction in detail, and tightening the structure around my freelance work so that deadlines and deliverables were insulated from domestic chaos. Even something as simple as establishing separate accounts for bills felt like a tactical maneuver, a signal to myself that I was no longer at the mercy of someone else's whims. But I didn't stop there. I started introducing micro-boundaries in our interactions. If she ignored a text or delayed a response, I didn't chase or plead. I noted it, adjusted my expectations, and proceeded with my own priorities, reinforcing the mental architecture I had built for self-reliance. Simultaneously, I leaned into my projects like never before. Long nights coding, testing, iterating, and problem-solving became a sanctuary where I could regain momentum and see tangible results, a stark contrast to the emotional instability at home. Yet the emotional stakes were unavoidable. Every accomplishment felt bittersweet because while I was building a professional foundation, I was also confronting the collapse of what I had thought was a lifelong partnership. One evening, as I wrapped up a critical deliverable, I noticed a subtle shift. Catherine walked past my workspace without acknowledgement, yet I felt a small spark of empowerment rather than defeat. That simple act, her silence, became a metric of my growing autonomy. I no longer depended on approval or recognition from someone who had turned cold. The tension escalated further when she attempted to insert herself into decisions that no longer required her input, making passive comments meant to unsettle or provoke, but I met them with neutral observation and calculated responses, maintaining calm while silently reinforcing my authority over my environment. I also began reaching out to trusted friends and mentors, not to complain, but to gather perspective and advice, strengthening my support network while keeping my emotional edge sharp. Every interaction, every response became part of a broader strategy, reclaiming agency without resorting to overt confrontation, ensuring that while Catherine could disrupt my peace, she could not dismantle the life I was rebuilding. By the end of the month, the cumulative effect was palpable. I was no longer reacting to chaos, I was preempting it, structuring my life to withstand unpredictability, and growing more confident in my ability to navigate interpersonal and financial storms. The subtle victories, though invisible to outsiders, reinforced a profound truth. Control is less about dominating others and more about mastering yourself. And for the first time since the fracture, I felt a flicker of certainty that no matter what she did, my foundation, my mental, emotional, and professional base was stronger than ever. In that crucible of tension and quiet triumph, I understood that this was only the beginning. Taking back ground was not about punishing her or winning arguments, but about preparing for the inevitable escalation while emerging intact, resolute, and ready for the challenges that lay ahead.
The calm control I had been building was about to face its first real test, a fracture that would make clear the difference between preparation and action, because no amount of planning could insulate me from the consequences of human unpredictability. It started subtly, almost innocuously, a missed call that felt deliberate, a curt email, a fleeting glance that carried more judgment than I had ever seen before. And I realized that Catherine had begun testing the boundaries I had quietly established, probing for weakness, searching for openings I could no longer afford to leave. And in that moment, I understood that control is never absolute, only provisional, and the stakes weren't just emotional or financial anymore, they were strategic, because every response I made could either solidify my autonomy or give her a foothold to destabilize me. The first confrontation came on an ordinary afternoon when she decided to borrow funds from our joint account without telling me, a small transaction that on any other day might have gone unnoticed, but after months of careful budgeting and documentation, it became a clear signal. My boundaries were being challenged, and the quiet patience I had cultivated was about to be tested. I didn't react with anger or immediate confrontation. Instead, I reviewed the account, documented the withdrawal, and planned my next step, knowing that any impulsive reaction could escalate into a battle I wasn't yet ready to fight publicly, while silently reinforcing that this was no longer about compromise. It was about asserting my position without creating irreparable damage. That evening, when she returned home, I addressed it calmly, almost clinically, explaining that unilateral decisions were no longer acceptable and outlining exactly what I expected moving forward, all while keeping my tone measured and my demeanor unshaken, because in this game, perception is as critical as action. If she sensed fear or frustration, she would exploit it, and I wasn't willing to provide that leverage. Her reaction was immediate, sharp, cutting words intended to provoke, questioning my control, hinting at old grievances and perceived slights. But I held my ground, responding only with neutral facts and calculated logic, refusing to escalate emotionally, even as my pulse raced and my mind catalogued every inflection, every micro-expression, every subtle attempt to regain dominance over me, because I understood now that this was the true battlefield, not the grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but the small, deliberate tests that revealed character and intent. By the end of that evening, the boundaries had been reinforced, but the cost was undeniable. The first fracture had left emotional residue, a reminder that even the most methodical planning could not eliminate risk, that vigilance required constant adjustment, and that the quiet victories of control came with the weight of persistent tension. Yet, as I reflected later that night, documenting the incident, analyzing patterns, and preparing contingencies, I recognized that this fracture was also a turning point. It proved that I could respond strategically under pressure, that I could assert my autonomy without surrendering to emotional manipulation, and that the path forward would demand even greater discipline, foresight, and resilience. The first fracture had arrived, testing every skill, every boundary, every ounce of patience I had honed, and I realized that while the storm had not broken me, it had illuminated exactly what was at stake, and that the next move, mine or hers, would carry consequences far beyond what either of us could ignore.
The first fracture had been a warning, but nothing could prepare me for what came next, a series of events that transformed tension into palpable danger, revealing that the game I thought I was controlling had started to control me in subtle, insidious ways. It began with small disruptions in my daily routines, missed deliveries, delayed responses from colleagues, miscommunications that seemed too coincidental to ignore, and soon escalated into moments that felt almost orchestrated, as if someone were deliberately testing how far they could push me before I reacted, probing for weaknesses in my composure and timing, and each encounter left a residue of unease that I could not shake. Catherine's behavior, once sporadic and easily managed, became increasingly unpredictable. She started showing up unannounced under the guise of casual errands, lingering at places I frequented, all while maintaining a facade of innocence. And I found myself recalculating every step, anticipating her moves, wondering whether the normal boundaries of a divorced relationship applied anymore, or if I had unwittingly entered a chessboard where every casual gesture had a hidden meaning and every omission was an attack vector. The tension was compounded by the realization that others were now part of the landscape, friends who inadvertently relayed information, colleagues who asked pointed questions about my personal life, even neighbors who observed and commented, all creating an invisible network of awareness I could neither fully map nor control. And I quickly understood that control was no longer just about my reactions, but about perception itself. How I presented, how I moved, how I managed information. One particular evening crystallized this shift when I noticed a familiar car parked across the street, engine off, headlights dim, just far enough to observe, but not enough to be conspicuous. And I realized with chilling clarity that boundaries had been violated in the real world, that the stakes had moved from emotional manipulation to physical presence, and every instinct screamed caution, but my strategic mind needed analysis rather than panic. I spent that night documenting every anomaly, reviewing patterns, and building contingency plans, knowing that the smallest misstep could cascade into a public confrontation or an irreversible mistake. Yet even as I fortified my routines, the emotional cost became undeniable. Sleep was fractured, focus became effortful, and every interaction with Catherine carried a dual weight: the surface civility of our conversations and the invisible tension of unspoken power dynamics. What I began to realize, painfully but clearly, was that this escalation was no longer optional to engage with. It was mandatory, a reality that demanded both emotional resilience and tactical precision, because any hesitation, any lapse could signal weakness, and she was relentless in observing and testing. By the end of that week, I had imposed new structures on my life: precise schedules, restricted access points, meticulous documentation, and contingency protocols that accounted for scenarios I never imagined needing to plan for. And while this regimented approach preserved control in one sense, it also exacted a cost, amplifying the emotional weight of isolation and hypervigilance, and reinforcing a lesson that would define the coming months. Escalation is inevitable, and the only variable is whether you survive it strategically or succumb to it emotionally. The external pressures had become mirrors for internal stakes, and the first visible fractures of our relationship now threatened to crack the entire foundation of my carefully rebuilt life, marking the point where observation alone was no longer enough, and action, measured, deliberate, precise, was unavoidable. By the time the second week of surveillance and subtle provocations passed, it became clear that what had started as an invisible game of observation was no longer containable within routines or internal calculations. The stakes had shifted, and with each small violation, unanswered messages, ambiguous sightings, and whispered reports from mutual acquaintances, the fragile equilibrium I had maintained began to crumble, revealing that control was an illusion and that the forces I had only been anticipating were now acting independently, outside my preparation and beyond my ability to influence directly. The realization hit me sharply one evening as I returned home to find minor disruptions: a door slightly ajar, a package moved from its usual place, the faint scent of someone else's cologne lingering in the apartment. Nothing overtly threatening, nothing legally actionable, yet each detail screamed intrusion and demanded vigilance. My mind raced, tracing possible explanations, weighing probabilities, cataloging patterns, but underlying all of it was a gnawing sense of inevitability. The situation had passed the threshold where observation alone could preserve safety, and the moment for action, however calculated, had arrived. It was in that atmosphere of creeping tension that I recognized the personal stakes had merged fully with the strategic ones. Every misstep could expose vulnerability, every choice had cascading effects, and each interaction with Catherine, once manageable through polite detachment, now carried the weight of potential escalation. The emotional pressure was compounded by the isolation I had imposed on myself. Friends reached out, colleagues inquired, but I had learned to compartmentalize, to filter the noise, to maintain clarity. Yet the solitude amplified the impact of every anomaly, and the mind, left unchecked, began to fill gaps with worst-case scenarios, creating a feedback loop of anxiety and preparation. The turning point came when a miscommunication at work forced me to confront an unexpected challenge. A client meeting I had meticulously scheduled was disrupted by overlapping instructions, leaving me exposed, flustered, and aware that even the most carefully constructed systems could fail, and that the smallest external interference had the potential to unravel months of planning. In that moment, I internalized the first real taste of constraint, understanding that escalation was no longer hypothetical but active, and that my response would determine whether I remained in control or was pulled into reactionary chaos. Over the following days, I adjusted strategies, implementing stricter routines, enhancing surveillance, and refining decision trees for every conceivable scenario. Yet the emotional toll became unmistakable. Tension was a constant companion, sleep fractured into cycles of vigilance and exhaustion, and every interaction with Catherine, whether direct or through the lens of information filtered from mutual contacts, was a potential vector for disruption, reminding me that the cost of inaction was far greater than any miscalculated response. By the end of the module, the boundary between personal life and strategic necessity had blurred completely, leaving me with a singular, undeniable truth. The situation had crossed the line from controllable observation into irreversible consequence, and every choice moving forward would carry weight. Every move measured not just in effectiveness, but in survival, and the luxury of ignorance, or even of delayed action, had vanished, marking this as the moment where life's fragile calm shattered entirely, leaving only the raw clarity of a challenge that demanded courage, focus, and unyielding resolve. The weeks following the realization that observation alone could no longer guarantee safety were some of the most taxing I had ever faced, because the abstract threats I had been monitoring had begun manifesting in tangible ways, small at first but undeniably real, and each minor breach forced me to recalibrate not just my strategies, but my emotional equilibrium. I remember one afternoon distinctly, returning from a meeting to find my apartment subtly altered, not enough to be alarming to a casual observer, but enough to trigger every system I had put in place: a shifted chair, a drawer slightly ajar, a faint scent that wasn't mine. And in that instant, I recognized the first true cracks in the armor I had been relying on, the first moments where the invisible game of prediction collided with unpredictable human behavior, and the unsettling awareness that even the most meticulous planning could not account for every variable. It was no longer merely about being vigilant, but about responding effectively under pressure without revealing fear or hesitation, and I quickly understood that failure to act decisively in these micro moments could lead to cascading consequences that would unravel months of preparation. The tension was compounded by Catherine's growing distance, subtle gestures that conveyed dismissal or impatience, responses that carried hidden barbs, and interactions with mutual acquaintances that suggested she was moving forward in ways I hadn't anticipated, forcing me to confront not just the external consequences of her choices, but the internal ramifications on my own resilience and identity, as I questioned how to navigate a world where trust was fractured and assumptions could no longer guide decisions. Every phone call, every email, every seemingly innocent social interaction became a test of patience and perception as I filtered information, cross-referenced observations, and assessed risks, all while maintaining composure in public and professional settings, because the moment I faltered emotionally, the consequences would multiply, and I would find myself reacting instead of directing. One evening, an unexpected project complication at work amplified the pressure. Resources were misallocated, deadlines compressed, and the stress tested not only my tactical response, but my ability to remain detached enough to see the full picture. It was a stark reminder that the external world did not pause for personal crises, and that strategic mastery required constant attention, adaptability, and a refusal to let personal feelings compromise decision-making. By the time the weekend arrived, I was exhausted yet hyper-aware, Every noise in the apartment, every unfamiliar vehicle outside, every unanticipated message from friends or former colleagues became a potential vector of risk, and I realized that the situation had progressed beyond simple awareness into a state of perpetual vigilance, where emotional resilience and mental clarity were as critical as any physical precaution or strategic maneuver. The culmination of these pressures revealed a hard truth. Life had entered a new phase where stakes were no longer theoretical, mistakes had measurable costs, and each day demanded careful navigation of both external threats and internal reactions. The cracks in my armor were no longer subtle, they were the foundation for the challenges that lay ahead, and survival, success, and even personal peace depended on acknowledging that control was provisional, fragile, and continually earned, marking this module as the point where the story shifts from observation to active engagement with consequence and danger.
It started with what seemed like a small, almost innocuous misstep, a decision that in isolation would have gone unnoticed, but in the context of the careful equilibrium I had built, it became the first domino to fall, triggering a cascade of events that exposed just how fragile the balance truly was. And I remember the moment vividly. A single miscommunication at work caused a client to question my judgment, a situation I could have navigated before, but the emotional fatigue from weeks of heightened vigilance meant I hesitated, and that hesitation created space for doubt to enter, spreading like a shadow across every interaction that day. Simultaneously, on the personal front, Catherine's subtle manipulations and unspoken critiques began to intersect with this professional strain, creating overlapping pressures that made it impossible to compartmentalize. And I realized with a sharp clarity that the external and internal worlds I had kept separate were now colliding in unpredictable ways, forcing me to confront a reality I had long tried to manage from a distance, one where the consequences of inaction were immediate and unavoidable. That evening, I sat alone in the apartment, replaying the interactions in my mind, tracing every choice, every word, every pause, recognizing that strategy and preparation were no longer theoretical exercises, they were essential lifelines, and a single oversight could escalate beyond repair. The feeling was almost suffocating, a combination of dread and adrenaline that left me hyper-aware of every detail, from the faint hum of the refrigerator to the patterns of traffic outside, because in that state of heightened awareness, nothing could be ignored, and the margin for error was vanishingly thin. Then came the confrontation I had been anticipating, the first true test of everything I had built. Catherine called under the guise of casual conversation, but the subtext was unmistakable. A veiled challenge that demanded a response, and I knew that how I navigated this call would set the tone for the weeks, perhaps months to come. I stayed calm, measured, responding with deliberate neutrality while observing her tone, word choice, and pacing, cataloging every nuance, every micro-reaction, knowing that revealing impatience or anger would hand her control of the situation, and that maintaining composure was not just a tactic, it was survival. By the end of the conversation, I had achieved two things. I had protected my position, but I had also uncovered vulnerabilities, small openings that, if handled correctly, could shift momentum back to me. It was a delicate dance, a demonstration that control was not static, and that every encounter could reinforce or undermine the fragile authority I had painstakingly earned. That night, reflecting on the day, I understood that the first domino had fallen not because of a single catastrophic event, but because accumulated pressure, subtle oversight, and human unpredictability converged to create opportunity, and that realization hardened my resolve. Going forward, every decision, every interaction, and every pause would carry weight, and the stakes were no longer abstract, they were immediate, personal, and irreversible, setting the stage for the next phase, where the consequences of action, not observation, would define the trajectory of my life, marking the transition from controlled vigilance to active engagement in a world where patience, precision, and decisiveness were the only tools capable of shaping outcome and safeguarding survival.
The day after that first confrontation, the subtle fractures I had been monitoring for months began to reveal themselves in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, each one a ripple in the carefully constructed pond of my life, and I felt the weight of every choice pressing down on me as I tried to navigate a landscape that was no longer purely strategic but painfully human. At work, minor miscommunications escalated into full-blown misunderstandings. Clients questioned decisions I had long taken for granted, and I realized that my previous confidence, built on preparation and foresight, was being tested not by incompetence but by fatigue, emotional residue, and the sheer unpredictability of other people. And I found myself double-checking every email, every meeting note, every contract clause, as if missing a comma could become a weapon against me, because in that moment it felt like it could, and the anxiety was constant, a low hum that never left me. Meanwhile, at home, the absence of Catherine had left a vacuum that no routine or distraction could fill. The apartment felt alien, the quiet a reminder of loss, and I struggled to reconcile the life I had imagined with the life I was actually living, where her absence was not just emotional but practical, a sudden gap in shared responsibilities, conversations, and the simple intimacy of companionship that I had taken for granted until it vanished. I caught myself replaying old arguments and small disagreements, analyzing every nuance, wondering if there had been a point of no return I had missed, and the realization that some damage cannot be reversed settled over me like a storm cloud. Friends tried to intervene, offering advice, company, even distractions, but I was hyper-aware that external support could not substitute for personal resolution. I needed to chart a path forward that honored both my past experiences and the new reality, and that required confronting uncomfortable truths about my own reactions, patterns of expectation, and the ways I had allowed control to slip subtly from my hands. At the same time, the financial strain from the pandemic's fallout was not just a memory, it remained an undercurrent, shaping decisions in subtle ways, forcing me to evaluate risks, opportunities, and the sustainability of each step I took in both professional and personal arenas. Every email from a potential client, every negotiation with a vendor, every technical bug I resolved carried an amplified significance because the margin for error had shrunk to near zero. By the evening, I recognized that this cascade of consequences was both a trial and a lesson. The fractures in my relationships, my professional pressures, and my internal doubts were not separate phenomena, but interconnected, a web of cause and effect in which one misstep could exacerbate every other tension. And that understanding gave me both dread and clarity, because it meant the next phase of my life could no longer be approached with passive observation. I had to act deliberately, with precision, and with the full awareness that my decisions would create lasting impact, shaping not only outcomes, but identity itself. And that realization transformed my approach from reactive to proactive, laying the foundation for strategies that were no longer about preservation alone, but about defining the terms on which I would engage the world, reclaim authority, and ultimately turn the chaos of consequence into a trajectory toward resilience, growth, and eventual mastery over both circumstance and self.
The morning after I fully grasped the cascading consequences of the past months, I woke with a sense that the subtle cracks in my life were no longer hypothetical. They had hardened into real, unavoidable fractures. And I understood with a clarity that was almost painful that the decisions I made from this point onward would define not only the outcomes of my work and relationships, but also who I would become in their wake. I began the day methodically, reviewing everything I had built: the AI project, the fledgling client relationships, the code, the contracts, the emails, and the hours of effort invested into late nights and weekends, because I realized that each of these elements was no longer just a stepping stone, but a linchpin in a chain that could either secure my future or let it unravel in a single misstep. And I felt the gravity of that responsibility in a way I hadn't when my challenges were only internal reflections or abstract concerns, because now stakes were tangible, external, and unforgiving. As I moved through my schedule, I noticed that the mistakes I had once tolerated in myself, the hesitations, the overlooked details, the assumptions about cooperation, were now luxuries I could no longer afford. Every misjudgment could trigger a domino effect, impacting clients, colleagues, and my own credibility. And that sharpened my focus to a level that bordered on obsession, compelling me to double-check, triple-check, and anticipate not just the next move, but the next 3 moves after that, because I understood that inaction was just another form of risk. Meanwhile, the personal sphere demanded the same vigilance. Catherine's sudden reappearance in my life, her indirect messages, the knowledge of her past betrayals, and the lingering emotional residue could no longer be ignored or pushed aside. The tension between past attachments and present ambitions became a test of discipline, self-control, and emotional acuity, forcing me to separate sentiment from strategy and to treat interactions with precision, awareness, and deliberate boundaries, knowing that one misstep could reopen old wounds or create new complications. Throughout the day, I felt a strange paradox. The pressure was immense, yet it was also clarifying, exposing which areas of my life were under my control and which required careful negotiation. And I realized that this moment marked the end of passive endurance and the beginning of deliberate, irreversible action. My decisions would no longer be hypothetical exercises in planning. They would carry consequences that could not be undone. And that knowledge transformed my mindset from cautious to decisive. By evening, I had made choices that would alter the trajectory of both my personal and professional life. Commitments to clients, deadlines for deliverables, boundaries with Catherine, and plans for scaling the AI project, all executed with precision, awareness, and an acceptance that failure, if it occurred, would not be reversible. In that crucible of awareness, I understood that resilience is forged not just by enduring pressure, but by acting decisively under it, and that every deliberate step I took from that point forward was a testament to the lessons I had learned from betrayal, loss, and personal collapse, turning the weight of consequence into fuel for transformation and laying the foundation for a future defined not by fear of failure, but by mastery over circumstance, strategic clarity, and the unwavering commitment to turn the chaos of past missteps into a trajectory of purposeful, irreversible momentum.
The days that followed the decisive actions I had taken in the wake of irreversible choices were a strange blend of liberation and tension, as if the universe had simultaneously lifted a weight and placed me on a sharper edge. And I quickly realized that the clarity I had achieved in planning and executing my work could not erase the emotional residue lingering from Catherine, from the betrayal, the divorce, and the long months of isolation. I confronted the truth that while I had mastered control over my projects, my career trajectory, and the tangible aspects of my life, the intangible, the sense of abandonment, the lingering questions about trust, and the quiet ache of unfulfilled emotional expectations remained, demanding acknowledgement before I could truly move forward. And it was in this quiet, almost invisible confrontation that the real work began. Each interaction I had in this period became an exercise in emotional literacy, weighing responses, observing reactions, and testing boundaries, not just professionally, but personally, because I had to reconcile the man I had become with the man I thought I would be before everything fell apart. I started noticing how subtle triggers, her name, a news story, a mutual acquaintance, could ignite a cascade of feelings I had long buried. And I understood that controlling outcomes externally was one thing, but mastering internal equilibrium required a deeper, more deliberate effort, a constant balancing act between self-compassion and accountability, between grief for what had been lost and appreciation for what had been gained. As I navigated these moments, the AI project that had been my lifeline took on a new significance, not just as a professional success, but as a symbol of personal redemption, proof that pain could be transformed into creation.
and every message from clients, every milestone reached, and every small win reminded me that resilience is not measured by avoidance of failure, but by the courage to rebuild after being broken. And that each achievement, no matter how small, was an affirmation of my ability to shape my future despite the shadows of the past. Then came the day of the corporate event, a black tie gathering that felt like the culmination of everything I had worked for. Stepping onto that stage, looking down at the audience filled with colleagues, mentors, and industry leaders, I felt the full weight of my journey. The sleepless nights, the quiet despair, the months of relentless effort, and the lessons etched into my very being. And there, across the room, Catherine appeared, a living reminder of the life I had lost and the person I had become. And in that moment, I made a conscious choice. I spoke not only to the room, but to the chapter of my life she represented, weaving every word of my speech into a testament of patience, perseverance, and the transformative power of adversity. And as she wiped tears from her eyes, I realized that true closure does not come from confrontation or revenge, but from rising above, from creating a life so full and authentic that the past could no longer claim power over you. Walking off that stage, mingling with peers and feeling the quiet pride of accomplishment, I understood that the hardest battles are often fought in silence, within the mind and the heart, and that reclaiming agency, redefining purpose, and honoring one's own growth is the ultimate form of victory. And while Catherine's presence reminded me of the fragility of trust and the consequences of human imperfection, it also highlighted the depth of my own evolution, from a man blindsided by loss to one who had not only survived but transformed pain into momentum, proving that the only way to truly honor what we've endured is to use it as the foundation for a future we control, where past betrayals serve as fuel rather than shackles, and every decision from this point forward is guided by experience, wisdom, and the unwavering commitment to never let adversity dictate who we become.
After the corporate event, when the applause had faded and the lights dimmed, I finally allowed myself to sit with the quiet of the aftermath, reflecting not just on the milestones I had achieved, but on the journey that had led me here, the years of struggle, heartbreak, and relentless effort that had tested every ounce of my resilience. And it struck me that the real victory wasn't in the acquisition, the partnership, or even the validation from colleagues. It was in the reclamation of my own agency, in proving to myself that even when life dismantles everything you thought was secure, you have the capacity to rebuild stronger, wiser, and more focused than before. And this insight reshaped the way I viewed every setback, every betrayal, and every moment of doubt, turning them into tools rather than obstacles, lessons rather than losses. And as I walked through the city streets that night, feeling the cool breeze brush against my face, I realized how crucial it is to anchor oneself in purpose, because the external chaos will always test you, but clarity of intention and commitment to personal growth are the forces that ensure survival. And as days turned into weeks, I cultivated routines that strengthened both my mind and body, invested deeply in relationships that nurtured rather than drained, and approached work with a sense of creativity, curiosity, and discipline that only comes from having stared into the void and emerged on the other side, knowing that life's uncertainties are not to be feared, but embraced as catalysts for transformation. I reflected on Catherine not with bitterness or regret, but with the calm acceptance that some people are part of our story to teach us, not to stay forever. And that understanding freed me from lingering resentment, allowing me to channel energy into endeavors that mattered, to invest in projects that could leave a meaningful impact, and to support others who might find themselves in similar valleys of despair. Because if there is one thing I had learned, it's that pain loses its power when it becomes purpose, when it drives you to innovate, to create, to persevere, and even to inspire. I began mentoring colleagues, sharing insights not just on technical work, but on resilience, patience, and navigating professional and personal upheaval. And in doing so, I discovered that the act of helping others reinforced my own growth, reminding me that recovery is not just a solitary journey, but a ripple effect,
influencing those around us and magnifying the lessons learned. Looking back, I could finally see the full arc, from the naivety of early marriage and the shock of loss, through the dark months of despair and the grind of rebuilding, to the triumphs that now stood as proof of persistence and integrity. And in that reflection, I realized that life's ultimate lesson is not about avoiding pain or controlling every outcome, but about cultivating resilience, embracing uncertainty, and creating value, emotionally, professionally, and morally, in a world that will inevitably challenge you. The scars remain, yes, but they are no longer weights. They are reminders of strength, reminders that the future is not something that happens to us, but something we actively shape. And in that knowledge lies a freedom and a power that nothing, not even betrayal or loss, can ever take away, leaving me ready to face whatever comes next with confidence, patience, and a renewed commitment to live deliberately, purposefully, and without fear of the past. Because I had learned to transform every ending into a beginning, and every challenge into an opportunity to rise, proving that survival is not enough. It is the evolution into a life worth living, one built on experience, wisdom, and the courage to keep moving forward no matter what storms may come. By the time I reached this point in my journey, I had begun to see life with a clarity I never possessed before. The months and years of heartbreak, isolation, and relentless effort had crystallized into a new perspective where challenges were no longer threats but opportunities to test my limits, refine my skills, and deepen my understanding of both myself and the world around me. And this mindset shift wasn't sudden. It had been forged gradually through countless moments of doubt, sleepless nights, and the quiet, uncelebrated victories that came from solving problems no one else could see. And I realized that the true measure of progress isn't in external validation or material gain, but in the ability to maintain composure, focus, and integrity when every instinct tells you to give up or react in anger, frustration, or fear. And as I looked back on the pandemic years, the divorce, and the isolation that had once felt unbearable, I recognized that each setback had been a teacher, each loss a mirror reflecting what needed attention, each failure a test of persistence. And through this lens, even Catherine's betrayal and the months of emotional abandonment became components of a larger curriculum on resilience, trust, and self-reliance, teaching me that while we cannot control the actions of others, we can control how we respond. And in mastering that response, we reclaim power, dignity, and direction. And this realization transformed not only my professional life, but my personal life as well, influencing how I interacted with colleagues, friends, and even strangers, emphasizing empathy, patience, and intentionality in every conversation and decision. And it reshaped my approach to work, turning each project into an exercise in discipline, creativity, and strategic thinking, reminding me that true mastery comes from combining skill with emotional intelligence and a grounded sense of purpose. And over time, the accumulation of these lessons manifested in tangible achievements: the successful launch and growth of my AI projects, the acquisition deal that validated years of unseen labor, and the respect and trust of a team who had witnessed my resilience firsthand. And yet, beyond these accomplishments, the most profound transformation was internal, a quiet confidence that no external event could destabilize, a sense of calm anchored in the knowledge that I could navigate uncertainty, rebuild from collapse, and create opportunity from adversity. And this internal mastery extended to how I viewed relationships, how I set boundaries, and how I prioritized what mattered most, understanding that success without balance and emotional health is hollow. And I learned to protect both my energy and my focus, allowing me to invest fully in endeavors and people that aligned with my values, aspirations, and growth. And as the world continued to evolve around me, with its surprises, setbacks, and opportunities, I felt equipped to face each new day with intentionality and clarity, not as someone who had merely survived, but as someone who had been transformed,
someone who could harness adversity as fuel, convert pain into insight, and create a life that reflected not only achievements, but resilience, integrity, and wisdom. And in that realization, I understood the ultimate lesson. Mastery is not a destination. It is a continual process of learning, adapting, and applying hard-won insights to build a future that honors your journey, your values, and your capacity to rise. And with that awareness, I could finally step forward into life with confidence, purpose, and the knowledge that no matter what comes next, I am capable, prepared, and unstoppable.
As I sat back after years of struggle, betrayal, rebuilding, and unexpected triumphs, I realized that the story of those 3 years wasn't just about losing my marriage, facing financial collapse, or even achieving professional success. It was about learning how to endure, adapt, and emerge stronger. And this realization wasn't immediate. It had to be earned through long nights of doubt, moments of despair when even the simplest tasks felt insurmountable, and the countless tiny victories that, when added together, formed a foundation of resilience I could rely on. And what I discovered most profoundly is that life's chaos, its betrayals, its unforeseen setbacks, doesn't define us. Our response does. And so I stopped looking backward with regret or bitterness, acknowledging that every challenge, every heartbreak, every moment of uncertainty had been a necessary teacher, shaping my patience, focus, and perspective. And I learned that true strength isn't measured by wealth, status, or recognition, but by the ability to maintain clarity and purpose when everything around you seems to be collapsing. And as I rebuilt my career, turning a side project into a flourishing AI venture and witnessing the acquisition that validated years of unseen effort, I realized that external success is fleeting if it isn't anchored in internal growth. And that growth comes from self-reflection, persistence, and learning to trust not just the process, but oneself. And when I unexpectedly saw Catherine again at that corporate event, tears in her eyes, I understood that life rarely offers neat resolutions, but that doesn't mean the story isn't complete. Closure comes from within, not from the people or circumstances that once hurt you. And this awareness gave me freedom, the freedom to move forward without resentment, without fear, and without attachment to what could have been. And in that freedom, I found a sense of peace that had eluded me during the darkest days, a calm confidence that no external force could shake. And I realized that while I could not change the past, I could choose how it shaped me, turning pain into purpose, setbacks into lessons, and heartbreak into motivation. And now, as I look to the future, I see opportunity everywhere, not because the world has changed, but because I have. And that change, my transformation, allows me to navigate life with focus, integrity, and resilience. And I want to leave you with this thought. No matter what storms you face, no matter how deep the pain or how uncertain the path ahead, you have within you the ability to rise, rebuild, and create something meaningful. And just as I did, you can transform hardship into fuel for growth, and loss into clarity, and challenges into stepping stones toward a life that reflects your values, your strength, and your vision. And if there's one thing I've learned that I want every viewer to carry forward, it's this. Patience, persistence, and self-belief are more powerful than luck, timing, or external validation. And if you commit to them, you will not just survive, you will thrive. And while my story has reached this chapter's end, your story is still unfolding, full of potential and possibility. And I want to hear from you. What would you do if you faced similar challenges? How would you rise? Share your thoughts, your experiences, your lessons in the comments, because the truth is that we learn as much from each other as we do from our own trials. And if this story inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe so we can continue exploring real human experiences together, because every story has a lesson, every challenge has a reward, and the future is yours to shape. So take it, own it, and keep moving forward.